So good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where each of you is currently located. And I'd like to welcome you all to our second event in the series, Understanding Systemic Racism. I'm Anupama Rao, Associate Director of ICLS and organizer of the Ambedkar Initiative, which links the anti-caste legacy of Columbia alum, political theorist, and constitutional thinker B.R. Ambedkar, with broad, enduring questions about historical difference and ongoing redress. Now, our series is a response to the current conjuncture of new forms of global resistance, as well as the terrifying constraints on thought itself. As well, we seek to link what's happening here in the United States, where there is both a rethinking of the role of institutions, like the university in the 21st century, with what often feels like a return to very old conversations indeed about social difference. And to link some of these more local concerns with global conversations with social difference and radical equality. I encourage you to visit the ICLS website for more information on upcoming events in the series. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors now who've made this event possible, amongst others, in the series. The Office of the EVP of Arts and Sciences, the Barnard Provost's Office, Office of the Deans of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Institute for Research on African American Studies, the Department on African American and Africana Studies, the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, the Department of Middle East, South Asia, and African Studies, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, the Columbia University Libraries, and Columbia University Press. Today, we'll have a presentation by Professor Étienne Balibar, a response by Professor Nahum Chandler, followed in turn by a moderated conversation with them and with you, the audience. To avoid Zoom fatigue and in the interest of time, we have about an hour and a half together. I'll offer the briefest of introductions to our esteemed guests, who really need no introduction at all. Nahum Chandler is professor in the School of Humanities at UC Irvine, best known to many of us as one of the foremost scholars of W.E.B. Du Bois, and known especially for his monograph, X, the Problem of the Negro, as a Problem for Thought. Professor Étienne Balibar is visiting professor at Columbia in French and at ICLS. He is the Emeritus Professor at Paris X, Nanterre, and Anniversary Chair of Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University, London. He is amongst the foremost political philosophers of our time. Many of us, I believe, walk in his shadow, tracing paths of inquiry that he's opened for us. So it's a great pleasure, and it's an even greater honor to have him here with us today. Professor Balibar will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by an initial 10-minute response by Professor Chandler. Professor Balibar will then respond briefly, and I'll allow Professor Chandler to elaborate as necessary before we open up for Q&A with the audience. I'll gather about 3 questions at a time, perhaps paraphrasing many of your questions to keep a large number of voices in the mix, as many as possible. You'll probably see me squinting at my screen. I think your questions will appear in Q&A, and I'll be trying to deal with the chat function as well, so please ignore this and ignore me. And I'd like to welcome you again to today's conversation on race, the human, and humanity in these times. Thank you, Professor Balibar and Professor Chandler, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I realize I'm bothered by flies, just like the vice president, but I hope they. So that's a very tight schedule, Anu. So you'll have to be extremely strict. And okay, I take 1 minute to say that I'm extremely pleased and grateful to be here with you all tonight. I'm still not completely accustomed to talking to people I can't see. I know they are all very friendly, very eager to listen to our conversation and, if possible, take part in it. I'm absolutely delighted that Nahum accepted to be my interlocutor, renewing long friendship and interaction that began actually where he is now in Irvine, long time ago. So that's a great honor and a great pleasure. And I thank, of course, all the institutions and director and the directors and the assistant director of ICLS in particular. Okay, so I tried to cut my presentation to the format that we need. I will have to read it. I'm sorry for that. I hope it won't be too boring, too mechanical. And I absolutely want that Nahum, after that, has full time to present his own views. Now, for this introductory presentation, I decided to borrow a more specific title, namely, if I could show it, that would be clearer, the in brackets, human race, or if you prefer to make it more audible, the human, which is also inhuman race. In fact, this is a title I don't invent. I borrow it from a very good book published already a long time ago in 1997 by Leonard Cassuto with the title The Inhuman Race and the subtitle The Racial Grotesque in American Literature and Culture. This title involves an intentional play on words, which has a great importance in our culture. It is even more the case, I believe, when we examine the reactions and the reflections provoked by the current pandemic. Firstly, the inhuman race is indeed the Negro, the so-called Negro race, as it was continuously reduced to animality in the tradition of racist grotesque in literature and imagery, a tradition that reveals itself, in fact, to be the core of institutional racism, aiming at dehumanizing humans in order to subjugate, brutalize, exploit, and even exterminate them. But secondly, the inhuman race is a phrase that speaks about the human that as a race, I return to that, is inhuman. That is, acts inhumanly or in betrayal of the values that are supposed to embody the moral destination of the species. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay. This draws our attention to the fact that human race is a traditional equivalent of humankind, or human species in English, in use since the 17th century. And believe it or not, one of the first, the second, in fact, quotation that you find in the Oxford English Dictionary about that, dated 1692, is the following, from Gilden, etc. Whatever the cause of our different color be, I'm sure we're all of human race. And as a consequence, designing at the same time the whole and the parts, specifically the excluded parts, it is what critical theorists or linguists call the catachresis, or an antinomic, a contradictory name. Why would recalling this be important today? This is because it could help us articulating a deeper understanding of what the evolution of the pandemic reveals about the impregnation of systemic racism in our world on the one side, and a question about the new concept of our species that we need to elaborate in the context of this pandemic. On the one side, therefore, a systemic discrimination among humans, which, as we know, is at least as old as the constitution of the modern world system, based on conquest, colonization, slavery, and their protracted consequences. On the other side, what I would call a new materiality of the interactions which connect human beings to one another and subsume them under a common destiny for which they are, that is, we are, permanently in search of a representation and a foundation. A problem for thought, to put it in the terms of Nahum Chandler's classical essay, investigating the idea of race and the idea of culture as avatars of the human. Now let me begin with the first question. The question of discriminations revealed and intensified by the pandemic. I could be very brief because in a sense everything here is well known, provided of course we do not close our eyes and shut our ears. Nevertheless, there are some characteristics which perhaps need to be asserted again and again and deserve a terminological elaboration. They concern, I would say, the different effects, or better said, the differential effects or effects of differentiation of the pandemic on diverse social groups, some of which, as we know, appear privileged or protected, relatively speaking, some others exposed and disproportionately affected, not only by the illness itself, but by its consequences on everyday life, economic survival, family burdens, professional risks, etc. It is important, I believe, to be very accurate and nuanced here, in particular because we see that the reasons for the spread of a virus escaping control have many aspects, including moral and ideological ones. They include an administration whose president is an avowed medicine denier, or a traditionalist religious community which commits its own immunity only to the invocation and the intervention of God, or a group of youngsters who view prophylactic rules as mere expressions of the tyranny of the state and the neoliberal order, etc., etc. This shouldn't hide the statistical fact that all sorts of inequalities have become intensified and highlighted by the pandemic, just as it is a fact that a lockdown is not and can't be experienced in the same manner if you live in an affluent suburb or in an urban ghetto, and the risks of being contaminated at work are clearly not the same if you shift more or less completely to online work with your personal computer, or you are a nurse in a hospital. They are on strike today in Irvine, the nurses, or you keep cleaning offices and hospital rooms, or deliver orders from a grocery store in the city, and so on. A category which is at the same time moral, social, and anthropological has been now widely adopted to collect all these phenomena and discuss their meaning for the polity, that of vulnerability, as elaborated some time ago now by different authors, particularly Judith Butler in her study of precarious lives. I think that this is a very important category which allows it to think both the complex origins of differential treatments and in a pandemic, and the moral interpellation of us all when confronted with our neighbors who are relegated outside the dominant normality. I think that we should combine it also with the notion of sacrifice, voluntary or involuntary, thinking of the above mentioned inequalities at work in particular, and with notions of protest, resistance, empowerment of the vulnerable people themselves, so as not to fall into the trap of a mere compassionate discourse, however important it is to have a compassionate discourse in a situation of this type. But the next question is about the factors, the criteria, the markers of vulnerability, how they combine with permanent intersections of class, race, gender, disability, or pathology, more generally what is officially called in Medicare institutions pre-existing conditions, etc. And it is about why confer a special meaning to race and insist on it in such a context. I believe that the answer lies in a reflection on what I have called elsewhere in various publications, a problematic of anthropological differences. Anthropological differences, as I understand them, are separations within the human that are at the same time universally observable and continuously shifting, changing content, imposing binary categorizations and lines of demarcation, such as normal versus pathological, white versus colored, masculine versus feminine, etc., while remaining permanently challenged, of course, by differences and identities which prove more or less completely irreducible to their binary exclusiveness. They are always impossible to locate in a definitive manner or to implement without leaving a huge remainder, therefore also without needing an excess, I would say, an excess of institutional violence. They are, of course, historically constructed and changing, and they are at the same time brought to the fore and challenged in critical conjunctures, such as the current pandemic, where the dilemmas of solidarity and privilege acquire an immediate life or death importance. Now, race, as it is imposed more than ever by our society, even in a form of denial, as a pervasive instrument of categorization of the lives that matter and those who don't matter so much, is one of the most insistent, if not the most insistent type of an anthropological difference in this general sense, that of a division of the human according to essentialist criteria affecting the humanness of the humans around us and within ourselves. Some are deemed human genuinely or authentically, and others not, or some are deemed supra-human and others infra. The pandemic, with the progressive alteration of every aspect of the social life it produces, ranging from intimacy to politics, indicates that anthropological differences are not mere representations. They express themselves practically in systemic discriminations affecting how to live, how to die, how to survive, how to recover. They are producing the precarious lives and intensifying the uneven precariousness of our human lives in general. But conversely, different vulnerabilities and measures of exclusion from the full protection of life are always linked to forms of racialization of life in the broad sense. And it should be no wonder if the racial status of persons and groups, which forms the background of discriminations and combines them in a single system, always features in the center of this global, of this general pattern. just as it should be no surprise that it also provokes the most explicit rebellions against what is rightly perceived as extreme injustice. The cry of Black Lives Matter resonates even stronger and louder, I would say, when uttered by peaceful demonstrators wearing a blue, a white, or a dark mask in their nose and mouth. At this point, we may turn to the other question, which perhaps appears more speculative, less obviously connected to our present situation. Human race as a name for the kind or the species. I believe that the connection, nevertheless, is very direct, which can be shown by commenting quickly on the motto that was officially adopted by the World Health Organization in 2007. Some of you may know it. One world, one health. This is per se a very interesting formula, which seems to immediately evoke sameness and equality of medical treatment for all humans who inhabit the same planet. As Judith Butler already mentioned, again insisted in a recent interview from April 30th in Truth Out, every life is, I quote, equal in value to every other life, a value that cannot be calculated. So we are tempted to expand the formula, adding a third term: one world, one health, one humankind, or one species. However, this is not exactly what the formula was meant to indicate. In fact, it meant one single health issue for humans, for non-human animals, and for their common environment, because these three instances are interdependent. If the health or sanitary conditions of animals deteriorates, the health of or sanitary conditions of humans as a single species will collapse, and both can be preserved only if the environment remains healthy or sane itself. We can see that such an extension of the medical discourse involves problematic adaptations of anthropological anthropomorphic categories such as precisely health or conditions. But I will leave this question aside for now. What I want to insist on is the fact that the idea and the subsequent policy recommendations were prompted by the growing evidence, except for some presidential or non-presidential deniers, that the destruction of the natural environment has accelerated the outbreak of pandemics, in particular through the phenomenon of viral infections and mutations called zoonotic, which cross the so-called barrier of species. This is, of course, a remarkable notion whose meaning was largely ignored from the public until a few months ago and is now becoming almost popular wisdom. What it indicates with respect to our understanding of this species that we are is twofold. First, it is meaningless to talk about the human species or humankind or human race in the singular, or as if the human enjoys a privileged relationship to the classification of individuals within the same type and the same genealogy, if you do not take into account its dependency, the dependency of the humans on other species, whose condition is affected by the human condition and affects it permanently. All living species are coexisting and co-evolving. To express this, I would gladly plagiarize the formula, almost a motto, in fact, invented by the philosopher Jacques Derrida in the realm of culture. Any singular language, he wrote, or idiom, only exists in the form of more than one language. I think this is beautiful and very interesting formula. Similarly, we could say the human species only exists in the modality of more than one species. But there is a second implication, as the human species more intensely and more conflictingly relates to other species and becomes more dependent on their health in terms of its own health and survival. It also becomes more unified with itself in a material sense, now probably crossing a historical threshold. Let me elaborate in the very few minutes I still have on this before I conclude. The phenomena characterizing this unification, which I don't expand on this, is no longer only ethical and logical, but practical, are intensely material phenomena, particularly the phenomenon of contamination or contagion, and the phenomenon of immunization, which in the case of viruses can be only collective, with or without vaccination. Viruses are propagated among the humans, forming a single population. They are crossing every social, national, cultural boundaries and following routes of circulation which connect mankind with itself in multiple manners and directions in unprecedented forms today through air travels and migrations in particular. This is, as we know, called globalization, and therefore One Health, as revealed and called for by a pandemic, means global health. But what kind of unity is that? Material unity, I said. Clearly, it is medical, it is physiological and pathological, it is demographic, but it is also intensely and conflictingly political. Its modalities are directly determined by political processes and institutions, where I include, of course, markets and economic values, themselves increasingly politicized and inseparable from labor regulations, welfare and Medicare policies, etc. And these modalities could now evolve in sharply different directions, depending on the relationships of forces, and decisions, particularly government decisions, of course, such as lockdowns, protections, creation of medical facilities, distribution of vaccines, etc. In fact, they will evolve inevitably, albeit in a relatively unpredictable manner, because the crisis has launched a process of social destabilization, which will not stop, we can be sure of that, at any pre-established limit. The very meaning of this common name, human species, will therefore also evolve depending on the political recognition and treatment of those very anthropological differences which are becoming intensified and sometimes dramatically intensified under our eyes, including the racial differences and the medical or pathological difference. In philosophical terms, inspired this time by Foucault, I will say that this will determine a merging of the biopolitical and the cosmopolitical, of which the human species, which is more than one, materially unified in unprecedented manner, but also more violently divided with itself than it ever was, being almost formed of different humanities, is at the same time the patient and the agent in highly problematic manner. Once again, at the historic closing of a great cycle, which began, in fact, with the invasion of the Americas by waves of European warriors and settlers, generating, as we know, the greatest immunological collapse in the history of mankind, that is, the systemic extermination of 90%, it is widely accepted figure now, of the Native Americans, counting roughly 60 million people at the time, mainly through intrahuman contamination. Once again, I repeat, the human race as such is confronted with the dilemma of its own humanity and inhumanity in the form of its differential treatment of races. Thank you for being perhaps a little too long, and I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
So very much. So well within time. And Professor Chandler, please take it away.
Can you hear me now? Okay, can you see me? It's all good. First of all, let me begin by saying thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to participate, first of all, by Anupama, the Institute. But likewise, it is a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with Professor Balibar. It is a double honor in that I have my own experience, relation to his thinking, but it is also important to me to honor, recognize the relationship of generations. So to be invited to engage in discussion with the generation that has brought us so much, from the 60s to now, and notably and particularly on the occasion of this year, it is a responsibility that I take with gratitude. I have some remarks, but they would extend beyond the 10 minutes. Therefore, I will present my thoughts more schematically to enable conversation, and look forward to the chance to continue beyond this occasion.
Take your time, Nahum. Take your time, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very kindly.
I will shorten.
I will say three kinds of things, or pose questions. One is certain questions to Professor Balibar about his own itinerary and thought. Secondly, raise one question about his remarks today specifically. And thirdly, speak a bit about the value of a re-reckoning with the thought of W.B. Du Bois in this time. Yeah. You've asked me to address you as Étienne. I will do so in the formulation of these questions directly to you. But after that, it's my insistence on Professor Balibar. 3 questions. In the early 1980s, something of that moment and your experience of it led you to articulate in your published intellectual work a fundamental concern with racism. Could you offer us an account of what led you to such articulation and why it mattered for you? That's the first question. I'll add 2 more. Now, in 2020, how do you look back on that moment of the turn to the 80s in your own itinerary and in terms of contemporary history? Third, in 2005, referencing back at least to the early 1990s, you began to insist that we needed a new advance on the thought of citizenship. And at that point, it's very much framed in terms of the itinerary of Europe, European Union at stake at the turn of the century. By 2012, you had formulated a whole thought and fully formulated and elaborated a thought of anthropological or the anthropological difference. And then by 2017, in your book, Citizenship Subject, which to me is the full culmination, elaboration of this thought, in the closing essay, you formulate the thought of anthropological differences with an S in a manner that you've indicated today. What do you think about this topos from the turn of the century now in 2020 in this year? There's a whole lot that I could ask about that, but I'll leave it at that. Those are the 3 questions. I'll ask the 4th question and leave Du Bois perhaps afterwards. The 4th question concerns your presentation today and what I might call the conjunctive question of the intensification of unification and at the same time the intensification of diversification of the so-called human. To me, I'm struck by that as the sort of through line of what you offered us to think about today. To me, that can be taken in part as a setting for the question that we're facing now. How do we think that? So I'll pause and I'll stop there. And if I may, Anupama, I would like to then speak more about Du Bois as we go on. Does that make sense?
Sure, we can come back to you and have another opening for Du Bois, which I think, we should take up separately. Absolutely.
So then I turn the question back to Professor Balibar.
Okay. Okay, Anu, are we still more or less?
We're absolutely fine. Please take your time.
Okay, and I ask you again, be very strict. So how much time do you give me now? 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll come back and take up Du Bois and have another 10 minutes and then open up.
You said 5 or 10? I didn't hear.
Take 5 to 8. 8.
5 to 8, okay, in the middle, okay. So I have to be extremely quick, and I spare you, again, my expressions of gratitude now for the questions, but they are extremely sincere. Let's go to the questions and be as simple as possible. With your permission, Nahum, I will combine the first 2. because they have to do with the guiding thread, if you like, or the continuity of my interest in the question of race. Now, in a sense, there's no there's no need to justify an interest in the question of race if you live in a society. That's the case for the United States, that's the case for France, slightly different patterns because the histories are not totally the same. And in fact, it's the case everywhere in the world where the question of race, with greater or lesser intensity, depending on the conjunctures, is an absolutely central and decisive issue, both from the moral and from the political point of view, and therefore calling, of course, for reflection. But if I may add a quick, more personal indication, I would say the following. There was a kind of not contradiction, but tension, if you like, in my early training and introduction to these matters, which came from the fact that I had been a student in the early 60s, when the War of Algeria for its independence was not finished. And of course, the racial question in the form of the scars and wounds and violences of the colonial system was absolutely central in determining my political orientation, just as, of course, for many others in that generation that you quoted before. But then at the same time, and I spare you the details, etc., I became a Marxist. I became a member of the Communist Party for a long time, and I became a Marxist. And I jumped to the conclusion. The paradox of all that was the fact that Marxism as such had nothing to say about race. So you could, of course, Marxists individually and personally address the issue in many and sometimes in very interesting manners, but as a theory, and as a foundation, I would say, to think the political and to intervene in it, it was always reduced to something else. Reduced to imperialism, reduced to class relations that provided important insights, but that left the question as such totally in the dark. And then it happened in the later, I mean, in the 1980s, two things happened. First, the neo-fascist organizations or political parties, in the French case, the so-called Front National, etc., began to rise again and become influential in local and even in national politics. So we faced, so to speak, the specter of a history many of us had thought was past, and in fact proved to be extremely present. And of course, this organization has roots both in the French tradition of French fascism on one side, and in the colonialist policies. And then I met Immanuel Wallerstein, with whom I later co-wrote a book called Race, Nation, and Class, and we discovered that we had similar concerns, but also different frames of theory, and we started working on that. And with time passing, of course, the importance of the issue is not only did not decrease, but became all the more important. Then I came to the US, and I discovered, of course, I started to learn and to read, and to, of course, I had read Fanon, that was part of my early training, but I knew nothing about Du Bois, and more generally, my acquaintance with the legacy of slavery in this country and the new problems with immigrants from the South, etc., was extremely abstract and formal. So I don't say I know that very well now, but I've started to learn more, and I became aware of the fact that you cannot think about the world if you don't inscribe the question of the color line. And here I must, of course, refer to Du Bois, both subjectively and objectively, both globally and locally, at the very center of your picture or representation of the world. From which I jump, I'm afraid I'm already too long, but I jump to the question of anthropological difference. I'm not the owner of that of that category. It's in more or less wide use among philosophers, particularly in Germany, and etc. But the important thing is that I would say that almost everywhere you read about anthropological difference, it's used in the singular. It's used in the singular, and this means, and in a sense, today I was returning to that, it means that you talk in a philosophical or sometimes more empirical or biological manner about the so-called or the alleged difference between the human and the non-human species, which means the animal. What makes us humans so different? Or why do we perceive that? Whereas I was using the category anthropological difference in the plural, and I started, of course, enumerating with huge problems, of course, after I had been convinced by the reading of Foucault that there is a certain pattern, logical and also political pattern of double bind, which affects the representation and the implementation of certain basic distinctions within the human itself. And I mentioned gender and sex, of course, race and culture or ethnicity, normal and pathological. This is, of course, the center of Foucault's reflection. And you could add, and you should add others. What they have in common, what they seem to have in common, which is enigmatic and fascinating in a sense, is the fact that you cannot escape them. You can say whatever you like. There's no experience of life, of the world, which would spare you taking into account the idea that certain demarcations are distributing, I would say, the human into categories. But at the same time, you're never able to say, here is the line, and this is a line drawn forever. The experiment that I always do with my students in class when I teach about that is I tell them provocatively, let us imagine that we will now decide that those of you who are normal, you move to the left of the room, and those of you who are pathological, you move to the right. This is extremely violent. This is extreme. And the violence, in fact, is both in the denial of the difference and in the inscription of the difference, I would say, in categories and etc. Now, race, of course, is central in all that. And to conclude for that, I would say that your suggestion, and I hope very much that you will say more, to draw from Du Bois important lessons in this respect convinces me that, in fact, I should not project on Du Bois or others a ready-made category of anthropological difference, but I should start reworking that categories and experimenting with it in the light of what we can learn from Du Bois and observe in the current situation. Which leads me to the final point, and your very correct understanding of what I was trying to do today. I absolutely believe that concerning the human species or the human race, a transformation is underway. A transformation which is political, but which is also epistemological. This notion has had different meanings throughout history. It is changing, so to speak, under our very eyes. But it is changing simultaneously into antithetic directions or displaying the same kind of double bind. There's clearly more unity, it's not purely ideal, more unity among all of us humans than it existed before. And the pandemic illustrates that very forcefully and vividly, except that this is not a unity only with humankind as such. It's a unity with a broader environment. And on the other side, the divisions or differences, which were always socially, politically, economically important, appear as well in the current situation. This would be the same if we spoke about the environmental crisis, of course, as matters of life and death. Reason why I suggested that Foucault's bio idea of the biopolitical should also immediately become understood in terms of the cosmopolitical we need. But this cosmopolitical, as much as any previous idea or representation of the political in the past, is not, of course, offering us a picture of harmony and and simplicity. It is, and of course, as a consequence, of course, the idea of the unity of mankind is a project, and is a task rather than a simple assumption. I knew you should cut me, and you didn't do it.
No, this is fabulous. Thank you. And maybe this is a good point for Nahum to come back in and speak a little bit about Du Bois, who's been called up in the context of the discussion around race and Fanon and so on. So Nahum, if you wanted to come back in.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Balibar, for taking the time actually to share. I want to see if I can connect what I want to say about Du Bois generally directly to the main suggestion that Professor Balibar has offered today of this double movement, simultaneously a unification, intensification, and a diversification. Then I will link this directly to Du Bois. It's by way of Du Bois that I say what I'm going to say first, but I'll connect it to his thought directly in a moment. The first thought is that this double movement is historical and runs through the entire modern epoch. That it is, in fact, a contemporary, timely expression of something that is more millennial in its articulation, more than half a millennium, than it is of this year, these months. The core thought is that in the emergence of what we think of as the human, or have thought of it, tend to, there is simultaneously the production of a so-called dignity of the human, dignification of the human, where there was not such a conceptual, epistemic, political space, theological, scientific, dignification of the human on the one hand, but absolutely simultaneously of the same moment, there is the production of the denigration, the production of the less than, not quite human, inferior human, subhuman, almost non-human, that could be treated inhumanly within the frame of the human. The double production of the simultaneous dignification and denigration. Obviously, Du Bois emphasizes the history of modern enslavement from the middle of the 15th century, 1441, 1442, all the way through the end of the 19th century. 15 million people, more than 40,000 ships, and entailing in its eventuality all geographical domains of the globe. I like the annotation that Professor Spivak has given us. She references another scholar, activist, that naming is important, not calling someone a slave, but those who are enslaved. That gives us traction on the production of the denigration. That's precisely encapsulated, for example, in the world historical example of Virginia. In 1619, when Africans arrive in what is now called Jamestown, out of the lower part of the Atlantic coast of Central Africa, it's doubtful that we can specify the status of those Africans in terms of the thought of the human. You can do it by other idiomatic formulations, religion notably. And so there are a series of laws that are passed to declare that an African woman should be treated as taxable in 1632, which was not the case 10 years before. Distinguishing gender that we would think of. 1662, a law passed that would indicate that progeny of a woman would bear their status in the subsequent generation. What's notable is that we do not have a concept that I would call race at that point. But a century later, in 1772, 1773, a young woman is born of an English captain and an enslaved woman of African background. Her sister, or her birth sister, was born subsequently of the same father, but with a different woman. And they then are defined by race as different. One is considered susceptible to becoming the common law wife, legal wife of Thomas Jefferson. The other, his enslaved property. 100 years earlier, that distinction had no bearing. We live in the wake of that distinction, of that production. That's an example of the simultaneous production of dignification and denigration. Let's not leave unremarked gender on both sides of that. That example, and I don't want to stay with it for sake of time, I intend here to simply remark that what we see happening in 2020 is epistemically, politically, economically, theologically continuous with the historicity that we see taking shape from the 17th into the 18th century in that part of the world. I've talked about 8 minutes, so I want to pause there and say that that's by way of an example. And I could schematically, obviously, say more in some other context, but I simply want to remark one thought and close 10 seconds. That's my own mark telling me it's time to stop. I would say that what we have is indeed an intensification, a contradiction in Marxist terms, in the terms of Karl Marx. But I would argue that that is tendentious. Moments of ebb and flow, moments of intensification, moments of its publicity and moments of its being put in shadow. And finally, I remark, it is the example that guides Du Bois's thought. And let us not assume we know what this means when I use this name. It is the African-American example. Let us not assume we know what that means. But that is the example that guides Du Bois' formulation of problem. I finally finish. I did say I would finish, but it occurs to me that I should say, I don't know in major European thought, hegemonic American thought, the main thinkers out of Asia, with some exceptions from the Indian subcontinent, Ambedkar being one, where there is a fulsome systematic engagement with the historicity of modern systems of enslavement. That is a turnkey or a touchstone reference for Du Bois. And if one reads Du Bois, that's unavoidable. I'll stop there.
I think we would love to hear you say a little bit more about Du Bois' name if you wanted to take a few more minutes. It would be important. And then we can open up for questions, definitely.
Then if I can, I will cross it back to connect to Professor Balibar's thought of the anthropological difference. I believe that we can metaphorize what Du Bois called the problem of the color line to speak of forms of categorical prescription. Those could be by wealth, religion, supposed differences of sex, education, geographical location, genealogical itineraries of the family line, etc. It could be by political status, declared legally, of legalities of one kind or another, citizen, non-citizen, etc. That if one understands the core part of Du Bois's thought of the problem of the color line, such can happen. The second thought is that I believe that what Professor Balibar has raised under the heading, the thought of the anthropological difference or anthropological differences, depending on the whole of that elaboration, speaks to something that is fundamental as a problematization for modern thought that has not yet been fully thought. I think you're exactly correct about the status of it haunting, I might say, contemporary political philosophy and philosophy in general. In 2003, at Irvine, Professor Balibar, you referred to the first of the two essays on Geschlecht by Jacques Derrida, and posed the question of the anthropological difference to place in proximity to his working of the thought of sexual difference in a critique, a questioning of Heidegger. I believe, I want to know if he answered your question that you implicitly ask of his relation to your proposing that thought. But more fundamentally, I want to suggest that this entire problematic, as has been marked by the Heideggerian intervention from the 1940s in particular of humanism, but all the way back into the 20s, its inheritance in the work of Michel Foucault, in the itinerary of Jacques Derrida, it seems to me, from one end of that reference to the other, the question of the status of the question, posed by your thought of the anthropological difference, and specifically the thought of placing race, quote unquote, and elaborating it as a question proximate to the questioning around sexual difference, remains almost unengaged, not fully engaged, partially engaged, empirically engaged, but not conceptually, theoretically. I could say a lot more, but for now I would like to say that it's possible by way of Du Bois's thinking to formulate a pathway. I found that I had to turn away from Foucault. I had to turn away. I couldn't find the recognition, and you know how closely I followed the itinerary of my teacher from afar, Jacques Derrida. I could not find the pathway in those examples. And my interrogation of this question around Heidegger yielded more impasse than passage. So it was tarrying with the work of Du Bois that allowed me to begin to formulate a thought of what I would call the para-ontological. I would give one formulation, Anupama, here briefly in the next 30 seconds, and then I'll stop. The thought that difference as such is no thing. That's not subject in the same way that Derrida elaborates the grammatological problematic in the 1960s for the thought of the trace. Yet, if I may now put it in Derrida's terms, the trace is always only material, even if it has no form of being as presence as such. In practical terms of politics, cannot fail to address that materiality, even though it is no thing. It will function with massive effects. A para-ontology allows one to do that, to think no thing. To me, difference of sex, and in a way that, to me, German thought does not help us with, difference that we tend to think of under the heading of race, the concept of race. These two differences are fundamental in a distinctive way, not absolutely. And I'd like to finish by saying, if I can get my note formulation to that effect. Yes, I found it. That is, difference of sexuation or sexual difference and differences, so-called differences of race, have a different relation to the history of metaphysics in Western thought and globally than do the other kinds of anthropological differences of which you speak, which I would profoundly affirm. And that there has to be some way, not simply to separate them into categories differently, but a kind of thoughtful politics that can nonetheless address that not all anthropological differences function with the same effects according to the same lines. They have their own materialities, their own historicities, and they can be gathered and addressed in that manner. So I've tried to say that Du Bois gave us a thought that allows us to think of categorical determination with his metaphor, the problem of the color line. And then secondly, it poses a question of how you can think something like the concept of race in a manner that would be commensurate with the interrogation that Derrida raises in his Geschlecht inquiry around sexuation. I'll pause right there.
Thank you so much. Professor Balibar, if you wanted to respond, please do. We have two questions, and I think they'll allow each of you to, we only have two questions, I should say, at present, and each I think will allow you to further elaborate as well, but I wanted to give Professor Balibar a chance to have a brief response, and then I'll read out the questions that we have.
Anu, just before the proper session began, we had gathered around our cameras a few minutes ahead, and you said this is a program for a whole conference. So, of course, it becomes more and more complicated. But also, owing to what Nahum has just said, I believe, at least from my point of view, pointing at the most central issues. So I don't know if everything we're discussing now is or is not to be subsumed under what one contributor just called European or Eurocentric universalism, which he suggests we should kick out for good and move to something else. Perhaps it's not for me to judge. It's not for me to judge. But there are, and we must come to the other questions. But there are two things I want to say very quickly. The first is I totally agree with Nahum that the questions we are discussing here, which on one side, of course, are completely historical, or totally concrete and linking to our most immediate experiences, are philosophical questions in the full and most demanding sense of the term. Therefore, the questions of ontology or para-ontology, I come to that in a minute, or the metaphysical understanding of such notions as difference, but species as well, of course. I mean, if a notion is a metaphysical notion par excellence, this is the species. It traces back to the idea of type, to the idea of eidos or essences. This is not, at least for me and not for you clearly, these are not idle questions to be kick out as quickly as possible, to return to the concrete and the burning issues. We're not forgetting these burning issues. Now, when you said that you found no pathway in particular, not only in what I wrote about the anthropological difference, but in my simultaneous references to Foucault and Derrida, I totally agree with you. I mean, Foucault and Derrida are both, in a sense, inheriting some something from Heidegger and so on, but they are like the water and the fire. I mean, they're totally antithetic on every question, and in particular, they both use sometimes the same words, and clearly give them totally different meanings. So, for example, quasi-transcendental. And I believe that this has a lot to do with what you call para-ontological, if I understand it well, and I will try and understand more. Now, the reference to the para-ontological or the quasi-transcendental is especially interesting because the language of ontology in Heidegger and others is a language that subsumes and covers, so to speak, the question of the essence of the human. It is projected by Heidegger onto a different level, and he absolutely wants a different terminology. But it remains, and the best readers of Heidegger know that when Heidegger discusses the so-called ontological difference between being, sein with a capital B, and beings with a small, etc., however big they can be, what he has in mind, of course, is asking the question, why is it that we grant the human this privilege to question the relationship to being? And what Derrida did in Geschlecht, I'm very quick, as quick as I can, in which I found admirable and I drew great inspiration from there, was to say, wait a minute, underlying Heidegger's description is in fact a latent, repressed question, which is the question about the gender, or better, or even better, the sexuality of the Dasein. I mean, of this, and this is haunting every phrase of Heidegger, but carefully repressed. Now, what Derrida wants to say is not just something like come back from heavens and to the daily experience where there are men and women. He wants to show how problematic the very notion of sexual or difference and different sexualities is, and that's the important point. Now, if I come to my own idea of anthropological difference, I see as much profit, if you like, benefit in using a single notion as difficulties and problems. And the profit or the benefit is the one I tried to quickly explain, and this time I was borrowing from Foucault, when I said all these distinctions, all these binary distinctions, on which I agree with you, the interlocutor, European universalism relies very strongly, but not only European universal, all these binary distinctions work as double binds. They are possible, impossible, imposed, unacceptable, and in fact unaccepted, and so on. But then comes the problem: can you put all them under the same umbrella? And here I have to admit that it's there's a huge difficulty. Because, and I take this to be one of your main points, all these differences are historical, and each of them works in a specific manner, which cannot be projected pure and simply onto the other one. So race works one way, sex works one way, sex and gender. Pathology works one way, and there are others, you know. Adult child, that's probably one of the most difficult issues. So if you believe that you'll be able to develop a single discourse on all of them, you're sure to miss the important point each time. Now, it becomes interesting when you get to the intersection. I have nothing against the idea of intersectionality. That would be ridiculous. It's an extremely powerful and useful idea. But still, if I may say so, the difficulty I see there is that there remains a kind of certain tendency, which has good political sides sometimes, to add the categories. I mean, categorize and add the categories. So you take the arch example, and Spivak, in her description of the subaltern, moved away from that, which I find very interesting. You have the tendency to say, let's take a given individual, the one who is most violently and brutally exploited and discriminated, and that is true, of course, in our societies. Who is that? Is the one who finds herself on the lower side of each and every of these discriminations. So adding the problem of race to the problem of gender, to the problem of class, etc., as if you could somehow add them. It's true, of course, it works like that in many respects. But on the other hand, the question that you're raising, how to articulate differences which are heterogeneous, not only because they don't have the same name or the same reference, but because they do not divide the human in the same manner. This is the question I would like to put on the agenda.
Thank you. Perfect. So one of the three questions I think we've somewhat responded to, which is about the whether it's time to kick out a certain type of European universalism and to kick it out of the window, or whether we should still stick to a certain reconstruction of an anthropological understanding of the human. I have two other questions that I think fall broadly into the question of kind of politics, response, resistance, or the relationship between philosophy and politics. One question asks, in the project of human unity, what is the role of presently categorized cultural, racial, gendered identities in resisting oppression and victimization? And it comes back to this question of problematizing intersectionality, thinking of intersectionality in a kind of a geometric manner, I think, in the way that Professor Balibar, you were critical of. But if that is indeed the case, that we have incommensurable differences, all in some sense.
I was critical of what? I was
critical of intersectionality.
Be very careful. I don't want to find myself on the wrong side of the debate on intersectionality.
Well, we may be on the same side of that, but really, I think the question is asking how we would respond to kind of racial, gendered, etc., right? Forms of
I would not caricature anybody. I would be wary of that. But it would be only too easy, it would be only too easy to say, oh, this guy, let's take all these differences. He's always on the good side. I mean, the one that is socially valorized and institutionally recognized. So he's a bourgeois, white, intellectual, and so on, male, and so on and so on. So what can he say about intersectionality? He doesn't know things from the inside, and I would be ready to grant that. So I have to learn from that.
But hang on. So one is to really say, how do we think in a more complicated way about the question?
Yes, I understand.
Oppression and victimization. And then there's two others. And
let me say just one thing about that. Perhaps this is the wrong thing to say, or it's risky, but this is something I believe I learned precisely, theoretically, I would say, practically in different situations, but theoretically from the reading of our friend, our great friend and inspirator, Gayatri Spivak, in that famous piece, The Subaltern Cannot Speak, whose I'd say illocutionary or performative status is already something extraordinary, because when she writes, and she wrote it first in an essay, which was included in a book and rewritten, she never stopped elaborating that. So what is she saying? That those people, the autochthonous or indigenous women in colonized India, actually cannot speak. or that their speech is suppressed and repressed, or that what they say is not heard and is not audible because it's not considered. It's all of that together. But then what I believe she beautifully demonstrated is that there was a dominant contradiction. Nobody would forget that, which is the colonial domination weighing upon all the colonized people. Hence, of course, this other extraordinary formula that she coined, as if the colonizer spoke his own truth. Let's have white men liberate brown women from the power and domination of brown men. But then she never said that the condition of the Indian women was simply I would say, a piling of different types of domination without any internal tensions and possibly contradictions. And as a result, of course, the struggle against patriarchy and the struggle against racism and the struggle against other forms of domination do not form a simple and ready-made, I would say, unity. So intersectionalists don't say that, but I believe that to take into account these internal contradictions, that's what I believe to hear from many other people who are not in the same situation as me. This can be resolved only in a concrete manner, in a given political conjuncture, through the invention of certain new discourses and practices. So if philosophy helps bringing this idea to our intellectual consciousness, that's already something, you know. I'm not as afraid as Nahum. I don't know if he's afraid of situations in which there is no pathway. You know, philosophically, this is called an aporia, and we live in such difficult aporias that we need to give them their names.
I'm going to come back to both of you, or to each of you, I should say, with the final set of questions that we have from the audience.
Okay, go ahead.
Those together. Because I think they actually are two sides in some sense of the same coin. One is asking for a little more clarification on what unity entails. Professor Balibar, when you speak about the unity of mankind,
the unity of mankind
as a task as opposed to a material reality. Incidentally, how do we differentiate between such a unity as a material fact and as a political task? And why should we assume this task in the first place, if that's what you are intimating? That would be one, and I'm going to ask each of you to respond
yes.
this in your own ways, given what you've opened up. The second, closer to my world, which is thinking Du Bois and Ambedkar as well together, is a question that asks, since Ambedkar is also at the heart of this conversation, perhaps as a kind of meaningful absence, I'm fascinated about the search for universals, especially given the fact that difference and hierarchy are central to Hindu humanism. I call this Hindu cosmopolitanism in my work on urbanism in India. This is a question by Suryakant Wagmore, who is going to be our next speaker, by the way, in the series on October 23rd, and goes on to ask, should compassion necessarily be undermined? Maybe politics at the margins is also a demand for compassion and civility. So that's why I said these are sort of two sides in some sense of the same coin. What is the task, as it were, of the kind of philosophical rethinking that Nahum, I think, calls for, and then the attendant politics in its wake, and then the question of some of the kinds of terms and categories that we've been using. The question that I also have, just more broadly, because Nahum began by invoking the question of generation, And first of all, I think Professor Balibar's own intellectual autobiography, but I think also this question of in many ways, the return to Marx, heteronomy and Marx, but also the question of Marx and Heidegger that has come up. So in many ways, if we think the question of generation, of intellectual formation and so on, and the kind of breach that is being proposed by reading somebody like Du Bois or an Ambedkar, and thinking of them as really constituting this breach in the philosophical tradition. What does that kind of leave us with? One is, one continues to be deeply interested. This is the question for our day-long conference.
Yes.
Because it poses, I think, then the question also of historicity and the relationship between philosophy and historicity, and more broadly yet, the question of reversibility, permeability, and then indeed what is inaugural. Something that actually comes up in the conversation today that we started with in terms of the question of the human, the inhuman, dehumanization, and now the kind of moment that we seem to be standing, the precipice that we're standing before in terms of a new way to think species life and or the end of the human completely, or the humanization of everything. I don't know where we stand, but I think this question of historicity going forward, going backwards, what is permeable and what is truly inaugural is also something that is posed. It comes up, of course, in terms of the problem of the name too. Name speaks about the African-American as a kind of example, an example to be thought. If we think Ambedkar, the Dalit becomes, and the way that Ambedkar thinks about the Dalit and gives to it a kind of name, but also kind of historicity and a pertinence. It ain't no thing, but you need to think the thing. I think becomes very significant to ask about. So just some broad questions. Each of you, please take about 5 minutes. We're well over time, but I think, we're not going to let you go before having your final words.
Perhaps Nahum would agree to start?
No, I want to listen. I've said plenty.
Oh. Yeah.
We would love to hear from both of you.
You
have to, yes, please.
Then I'll speak very quickly. 3 points. First of all, I didn't recognize if I spoke about universalism as much as I did, but I respect the question. I would simply say that is not my intent. Then 3 quick points underneath that. The first is that the thought of the transcendental is itself historical, from Kant to the questioning in Heidegger. Although I agree or affirm the reception that Professor Balibar has given to my thought of para-ontological, let me say I'm hesitant about the word quasi-transcendental. That's not my intent. And secondly, in the same breath, or the other side of the same coin, para-ontological is a word that I use, a formulation I use precisely to speak of this problematic in its relationship to traditions that are dominant, hegemonic in European thought, the inheritance of Greek conceptuality in the modern period. That's it, not with regards to every other aspect. Quickly then, 2 other points. I believe that one must produce a difference. And I believe that there's a central aspect of that in Professor Balibar's work. To me, without the production of that difference, you turn to figures of neutrality, which I see as continuous back through with the thought of the transcendental, back through Heidegger into the 18th century. I'll leave that and say finally, I believe the most difficult question of our time is an affirmation of a recognition that one's own most formation as an historial, as a being may be or is, in fact, through the enemy. And to affirm that, to recognize it, that's the question. What could happen with George Floyd is someone could say, 4 officers, whomever they would think they are from whatever background, him, he, that's not me on that ground. And that's the difficulty of our time.
Very much so, very much so, very much so. We find double binds everywhere. It is vital, I believe, for anybody who finds himself or herself in a situation, and usually several situations of subjugation, disempowerment, victimhood, I return to that, to reject the, viscerally, in a sense, in the identity, the kind of identification that is projected upon him or her by what you call the enemy. And although, of course, from a different point of view, and especially for the sake of uniting, I would say, uniting against oppression, uniting in compassion. I completely, I never said that compassion was not important, and uniting in emancipatory struggles and fights. There is, of course, an antithetic necessity to identify precisely with that image or status and reverse its meaning. So a long time ago at a conference in Berkeley, but that was not original. I wrote a paper with the title "Performative Reversal of the Name Race," but of course I was directly inspired by something that had been so important in our generation, even abroad, far from the United States, and that, of course, whose depth and rootedness in American history we did not very well know, but that was Black Power, or perhaps the combination of Black Power and free jazz. I mean, the simultaneous vindication of the color, the identity, and the experience. And I remember listening to Fred Moten in that same conference that you were alluding to a moment ago, who did something absolutely extraordinary. He had a quarter of an hour to give his presentation. He said, "I first want you to hear the sound of the Black voice." So he switched on one of these rudimentary recorders, tape recorders, and it began with a great jazz man. Suddenly I know him, but and then it continued. Listen to that, Nahum, or perhaps you remember, with Du Bois's voice that had
Roshan Roland Kirk and Du Bois.
Roland Kirk, absolutely, Roland Kirk. And Du Bois. And so the 15 minutes passed, and the chair said to him, "But Fred, please begin your presentation." And Fred laughed, and he said, "It's done. It's done." So that's okay. So when you say one must produce a difference, I accept this formula, and I propose, but I propose a slightly different formula. One must displace the difference. Displace the difference and displace the differences. Now, for all the questions that Anu has asked, there are some I I'm afraid I have to leave aside. Generation, Marx, Heidegger, etc. The question of historicity is deeply, in my understanding, is deeply connected and linked to the first question that somebody that you repeated. Why unity, and why to want unity to be a task? Because I have 1 minute, my temptation is to reply, because we have no choice. Because we have no choice. Because the opposite of unity, and therefore, like it or not, some form of universalism, or better, some form of cosmopolitanism. To me, the two things are not to be separated, and they are is a vital need. It's imposed. It's imposed by the current situation of the planet, by the dreadful consequences of the global warming and the pollution and the destruction of the earth. This is going to be worse, and therefore, of course, deniers are criminals, and we ought to eject them from their position of power. And the pandemic is adding something very important to that, which I tried to describe as new materiality, materiality of this interdependency, something that is not only outside of us, so to speak, but is in a sense woven into our bodies and conditions of life. But then, of course, the question is which unity? Particularly because the notion of unity and the notion of hegemony are historically so closely linked. So, of course, a unity from below, if you like, or a unity from afar, returning to us from afar, and above all, a unity that has learned something from the history of which we are now the heirs, the one that Nahum a moment ago so beautifully summarized, quoting Nahum and referring, of course, to slavery, which is a central aspect. That is something that started in 1441 and did not end until the late 19th century. So the question of unity has to be historicized and politicized in such a manner that when we speak of a task, we're not just calling for some new hegemony that would repeat the previous ones, because these hegemonies took us to the dramatic and even catastrophic situation in which we are now. And if we do not invent something different, we are all doomed. That is, the poor and the rich equally. But the solution is not in the hands of the rich. I'm not. I don't believe that. Not a single minute. Okay.
Thank you. So,
And can I
insurgents, please. Yes, absolutely.
Literally one state. In essence, and I think in doing this, I'm drawing very much from Professor Balibar's work as well as Du Bois. That is to say, I think it is recognized in Professor Balibar's work.
We're not on a par. We're not on a par.
But I think Du Bois formulated the question, which is simply this, that since the 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries, we have begun to think very well this idea of the common, of the human. However, we have not thought well the heterogeneity, the difference of the human at all. And it goes right to the root of the most traditional thought of the modern period all over the world, and right to the most forward-thinking thought of the modern period all over the world, Asia, Africa, as well as Europe and the Americas. And that, to me, is the question that is at stake. That's what I was trying to put on the table. And to suggest that we can take Du Bois as an example is not to say he's the only one. Where Professor Balibar refers to Mary Wollstonecraft, I refer you to Phyllis Wheatley. Where Professor Balibar refers you to Frantz Fanon, I'm referring to you to Du Bois, half a century earlier.
Of course, of course.
And so no difference between what you're, I'm just saying that's the argument that I'm trying to put on the table.
I agree.
And I was drawn to Ambedkar quite independently and prior to this, but I recall just this moment. You may remember that when I was kindly invited by you to Columbia, the first thing I said is we must remember they are of different generations. Du Bois was already 40 by the time Ambedkar is born. This is the same with C.L.I. James. So you can place Du Bois next to Tagore, but not next to Ambedkar. Ambedkar should be understood according to his own generation, his own trajectory in relation to Du Bois. And I would place him next to Fanon, actually prior to him, more C.L.I. James and Aimé Césaire. And if one does this, one begins to see a quite powerful interrogation of this problematic. That's what I've been trying to call attention to.
Beautiful, thank you. And I think an apt way for us to end this Friday afternoon for us, some of us here, for some of you. It's evening into the night, I think. Thank you all very, very much for being with us today. I think this was a remarkable conversation. And the fact that we were able to have it on Zoom without touch and tactility speaks to the enormous power of both Professor Nahum Chandler and Professor Étienne Balibar. So thank you very, very much again.